So welcome everyone. You are here with YANA, the Yale Alumni Nonprofit Alliance. This is our monthly virtual town hall that used to be in a conference room at the Yale Club in Midtown Manhattan. We've gone online and we've expanded it beyond New York. And today we've decided to have a sort of thematic program. Usually we spotlight just some different organizations, but we wanted to do it today. It happens to fall on the day that's the UN International Holocaust Remembrance Day. So that's our overall honoring theme. For those who this is your first time joining YANA, I'm Rachel Littman. I'm the executive director. I also aware that there are many other organizations out there today, like the UN. There are plenty of museums, religious institutions that are holding their own Holocaust remembrance programs today. So I very much appreciate you spending part of your evening with us. We do things in our own way. So hopefully this will be a good use of your time. What I wanted to focus on today was a little bit less on the kind of horrors of the Holocaust and remembering those who died and survived, and more about what we've learned and what we can apply in the future. And specifically now we've got a couple of representatives from different kinds of nonprofit organizations, which is within the umbrella of what YANA focuses on, to talk about some of the work that they do to move us forward as a world and as a community. So I want to introduce our terrific panelists. We've got who represent, as I said, 3 different organizations. We have Rabbi Brad Hirschfield of Clal, the National Center for Jewish Learning and Leadership. Professor David Simon, who is Senior Lecturer and Director of Undergraduate Studies for the Department of Political Science at Yale, and is also the Director of Yale's Genocide Studies program and the Director of that program's Rwandan Genocide Project. We also have Frank Stebbins, who is a longtime classroom teacher and now the Senior Program Associate for New Jersey Growth and Strategy at Facing History and Ourselves organization in their New York office. Right before I ask the first questions, I just thought I'd give us a little bit of background. Some of these things you may know, some may be new. Today is the UN International Holocaust Remembrance Day. Which commemorates, and my panelists will hopefully correct me if I'm wrong, commemorates the Auschwitz-Birkenau liberation, and it's also 80 years since the German invasion of the Soviet Union. This particular Remembrance Day is relatively recent. It was created in 2005, something we're going to talk about a little bit later. And this is different than what many people who are in the Jewish tradition in America and in Israel in particular, Yom Hashoah, which is Hebrew for the Day of Remembrance. That was created way back in 1951, and I'm sure Rabbi Hirschfield and others can give us some details for those who have questions about why we have these two things and what some of the tensions are. But that is tied to the Jewish calendar, and that's generally the week after Passover. That also is the anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. So, thank you to our panelists. If you guys could just wave, because I think we're on a gallery, so those who are seeing everybody, they can find you. Terrific, thank you. Okay, so we're going to do things a little bit differently. I wanted to start with start a conversation with a situation that everybody can relate to, and not to get too much into same old, but the January 6th storming of the U.S. Capitol. I know we're talking about the Holocaust, but bear with me on this. So if you can remember that, large group of people, mostly men, mostly white. Some of them had weapons. Some were carrying Confederate flags. We had people wearing T-shirts that said Camp Auschwitz, Oath Keepers, MAGA Civil War banners, shouting America First, which I understand is a Holocaust denier slogan that's been reappropriated. And that's really just a snapshot of kind of just an image of what was happening. And that's not even to get into all the other things that happened before and after. There's some great articles out there. A particular journalist at the New Yorker wrote one who followed them around if you want to get into a little bit more of who exactly some of these organizations were and these individuals were there. But let's talk about what we were seeing. But what I was doing is we were watching this thing unfold on live TV. And these are people that we're watching that others have called punks, deplorables, insurrectionists now, terrorists, etc. So we're watching this, and I happen to be watching on CNN, and Anderson Cooper, who happens to be a Yaley, so I think I can, I feel free and be able to say something like that. Oh, somebody shared the screen, and you need to stop that. Okay. I hope I'm not going to get spammed here. All right, we'll see what happens. Okay, so I wanted to say, all right, so Anderson Cooper says, as he's watching this, he says, well, all these guys are just going to go back to their Olive Gardens and sit around their lobbies and their Hiltons and talk about what a great day it was. And that really jarred me. And I first thought, like, how does that help? How does that help move any of this forward and have a conversation? So this is nothing to minimize what was actually going on, but in live media, when someone clearly just dismissed these people as individuals and categorized them as people who go to Olive Gardens and Hiltons, wherever that is. So using that whole situation, you know, the culmination of hate and despair and arrogance and ideological different viewpoints, the question I want to start out with each of you is, how do we approach something like that? How are we ever going to have productive conversations to prevent something like that happening and preventing this kind of a divisiveness, anger, sides from escalating to something that could become much worse than it was? So, Rabbi Hirschfield, you always have great stories. Let's talk to you first. What was your reading of this kind of situation?
So first of all, thank you for the privilege of joining, all of you, and Rachel, for you for leading it, to my two fellow panelists and everyone who's gathered here. Look, you asked a couple of questions, and one was about the Anderson Cooper response, and one was to the event. I want to be clear. There is no one answer to this, and there are clearly people there who all the reasonable conversation in the world, and I make my living in reasonable conversation, is not going to help. My personal belief is there are real enemies in the world, and some of them have to be fought physically. But as sure as I am of that, I'm a lot more sure there are a lot fewer of them than we like to tell ourselves. And that many more people can be meaningfully engaged if we want to. And it doesn't begin by making fun of the fact, especially when you have a 7-figure income, that they go back to their 3-star hotel and eat bad, fake Italian food. That's not how to do it. Now, I understand that heaping abuse on people who are doing horrific things, and many of them were that day, is a natural response. But I think, Rachel, what captured your attention, and I'm glad that it did, is it goes to the most important question which any of us confronting that day, I believe, have to start with. And it would have been important for Anderson Cooper to do it, given his role as a leader and an influential, whether he likes those titles or not, because he is at that moment. He is helping the country, or at least his audience, to write the story of the day. And so the first question we have to ask is, at such moments, not who are they, but who are we? Who do we want to be at that moment of assault? And I think that's how you begin to make headway. Because it's always easy to deconstruct the other on the other side, especially when they are so incredibly different in so many serious ways from, my guess is, almost every one of us who's gathered here. It's easy to do. But if there's a moment in which boundaries are being violated, and that's about the gentlest way I can describe what happened that day, the first thing we have to ask ourselves is, who do we want to be at that moment when the borders are being crossed? Are we the Border Patrol? And that's a real job, to protect the borders and the boundaries of that which is sacred to us. That's a real job. Do we want to be the crossing guard? Right? Is our job to help the flow of people and ideas, even though we ourselves are not really vested in the sides of either one, but helping them move across? Are we missionaries, in which our view is we've got to go tell them the truth, and when we tell them the truth, things will get better? Are we frontier scouts? Is our job to actually be out there among them as much as possible, trying to learn what can be learned from their experience before we set about taking them apart? And I think all of those jobs can operate at the same time in a situation. But we have to know who we want to be. My experience in working with people who, were they not sitting and talking with me, are affiliated sometimes with terrorist organizations. And that's not always easy. But the issue isn't who are they, it's who am I at that moment. And I start with two premises. Number one, and it doesn't matter if you want to put God in where I'm going to put in God, it's whatever you think. I don't believe God ever made anyone so smart as to be 100% right about anything. Maybe our two fellow panelists, but that's it. And I certainly don't believe God ever made anyone so stupid as to be 100% wrong about everything. And the last principle, if we want to make a positive difference, and maybe we don't. Maybe we've said, that's it. Here's the line. I am the Border Patrol. Shoot them. But then don't complain about polarization. And I believe there are times when there are real fights. I want to be clear. I'm not a pacifist. Maybe I should be. I'd be a terrible Buddhist. But I take responsibility for those moments. But if we're not going to do that, and we say, no, 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 we want to address polarization. We want to address mutual distrust. We want to deal with the fact that trust among people has plummeted in the last decade in this country and in the decade before. Then along with those two premises, that no one's so smart as to be 100% right and no one's so stupid as to be 100% wrong, is I know this, because all of us have our views and we want to share them with others. We're all a little bit missionary if we're deeply committed to what we believe in. I know this. Before I can be anyone else's teacher, I have to first be their student. And so when I watched the events unfold, along with anger and a fair dose of nausea at what was unfolding on television, I was also genuinely curious about the experience of those people. And I know that if I'm really committed to addressing polarization, short of direct physical threat, which I wasn't experiencing, I was home in New York City, I was good, then that curiosity has got to be the central tool I apply to that moment. I hope that begins to answer what you asked about.
It does. It does. I think that really sets a stage of your particular approach. I'm not sure how to do this. We're going to move over to Professor David Simon for your approach. You're an academic. You've studied Cambodia, Rwanda, the Holocaust, international comparative politics. What would be your view of this kind of event in the history of the world? And I wanted to note, I don't know if anybody saw this, whether you were a fan of his or not, but Arnold Schwarzenegger came out with an interesting video telling about his personal story and likened that particular event to Kristallnacht, which is a very specific event that happened in the course of, the precursor to the unveiling of the Holocaust. So, from your perspective,
sure. Thank you, Rachel, and thanks very much for having me on this panel. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm almost tempted to say no, thank you for placing me exactly after Rabbi Hirschfield. I think what he said was really moving and beautiful, and it's a tough challenge to follow immediately afterwards. But I'll appreciate that your question for me is slightly different, and I'll try to take it in that direction. What for me has been troubling, not just about January 6th, but about the past, I'll say 4 months, maybe I should say 4 years, maybe I should say longer, is the sense that there is a line that has been crossed or is always under threatened to cross. And maybe this is similar to Rabbi Hirschfield's point about border patrol. And do we want to be a border patrol? But part of it is, if anyone is going to patrol a border, you need to know where the border is. And it's nice to think that in sort of humanity, we have no borders. But in this particular issue, the sort of sanctity of our democratic process, of our democracy, and this is where I sort of get into, I think, where I see things from a slightly comparative perspective, there is a border somewhere. There is a line that we really have to defend from being crossed. Maybe it is when there is an insurrection, a mob, a riot, call it what you will, but an effort to disrupt the process of ratifying the election. I'm not an Americanist, so I'll probably have the term wrong, that an Americanist, someone who studies American politics, that is. It's that, maybe it's that effort to disrupt, maybe it was the implicit threat to do bodily harm to people like the vice president and others. Maybe it was a week earlier when there were calls to election officials with alleged efforts to bribe or put pressure to change the election results. Maybe it was sometime earlier, maybe it was Charlottesville, but that allusion to Kristallnacht, and I've heard the people that I've heard the most discomfort, anxiety over the threats to democracy in the US tend to be people with Eastern European heritage. And their references are twofold. They're both the onset of the Holocaust in the 30s and 40s, depending on where their families or their relatives were from, and the subsequent imposition, not subsequent meaning following directly from, but the imposition of a totalitarian state under Soviet rule. And in both cases, people are seeing what they're saying is, they fear that some line of sort of the sanctity of democracy is being crossed, and that once that line is crossed, it just deteriorates. Now, the task for the political scientists is to figure out, how does that deterioration happen? Can it be prevented? I think part of what Rabbi Hirschfield said is inextricably part of that task, preventing polarization. But polarization has a dynamic as well, that you have to fight against the dynamic, but you have to fight within that dynamic. And if someone is bent on extreme, pulling away from the center, that centrifugal force that breaks apart commonly held norms and institutions, those norms and institutions have to be fought for as well. And it may not be a physical fight, but it's a matter of using those institutions, standing up for those institutions, and perhaps recognizing, not by insulting their taste in Italian food, but recognizing that there are individuals whose efforts are going into the destruction of these institutions that we cherish so much. I could go on, but as you can see, but I want to stop and we've got a great program in front of us.
Okay, no, that's good. I think that's a good perspective from there. Frank, as a human, you're a human rights educator, let's say, now involved with a particular organization curriculum. How does the pedagogy, work with facing history? How do teachers, or how could they use that with Capitol storming? And just tell us what that approach would be.
Sure, and thank you for the question. And David, you thought it was tough following Rabbi Hirschfield. Try following both of you and trying to answer the question. But one thing that I want to recognize and enter in the conversation is recognizing the difficulty that it is about teaching events in real time and looking at events that are causing emotional responses amongst the educators themselves and their students in their classrooms. So one of the approaches that we recognize the importance of when we put out our educator resources is, before teaching, taking a step back and allowing yourself time to process your own thoughts and your own feelings. Those of us all have memories of educators who impacted our lives, and we know that an educator is always asking the question, how are my students doing, first and foremost? But recognizing, to care for your students, you also have to process the information going on, process your emotions, and be able to reflect on what you're experiencing. From there, how do we plan for discussing an event like this? What emotions might your students be bringing to the conversation? How will you respond to those emotions? Recognizing that as news is unfolding, as news reports are coming in, as students are home and learning more and more, that there are a lot of emotional components to events like this. And recognizing, and kind of to piggyback of what Rabbi Hirschfield was saying, as the news develops, how are we going to adjust our learning? As new information comes in, how are we going to revise what a lesson might be the night before as it develops for that day. And I think one of the important parts of our core work is looking at the idea of contracting, that we need to provide spaces for our students to feel not only safe, but to bravely engage in conversations, in dialogue, to look at addressing what they're feeling and maybe why they're feeling that way. And these aren't easy strategies to enact or embody in a response to an event on the fly. They take time to develop rapport with students and have that sense of safety and bravery, and more importantly, norms of how do we react if somebody's offended by something somebody says. And to add to that challenge of so many schools being in a virtual setting, how do we bring students safely into a conversation and out of a conversation when they may not be in front of us, where we can't necessarily see why they're turning off their video or how they're feeling. So just that added layer of complexity looking at the current events of teaching and education during this time. With reports changing so quickly, how do we share what we know is accurate information at that moment? Looking at places where, regardless of if a student is in front of us or at home, how can we provide them the opportunity to have an inclusive voice in the conversation? That might mean journaling and not unmuting on a conversation. That might mean just being able to produce a piece of artwork that's expressing how they're feeling. And looking at the classroom as a place where students should learn with intellectual rigor, but also emotional engagement and ethical reflection. How do we come to understand that their own views and choices matter? And with the resource that we put out, one of the 3 reflection questions that we asked students to reflect on were, how can you look at this event with your head, with your heart, and with your conscience? Tying together that framework, that pedagogy that I'll probably have the opportunity to get into more later. But in terms of what educators are doing, in the first 24 hours, over 100,000 views of that resource were seen on our website. And since then, 240,000 people have viewed that resource. The day after, I spoke to 3 different schools and 3 completely different demographics. And the first school I talked to, they said, we gathered this morning as a staff. We wanted to allow our staff time to check in with each other, to come up with a plan for that day, to look at resources of how to engage in difficult conversation, and to kind of have a unified conversation going forward. A second school I talked to said, we're really waiting to see what the student response is, and then we'll go from there. And the third school I talked to said, this was the only thing our students could focus on today. We could not have an agenda other than engaging in conversation with what happened in the last 24 hours. So it's extremely difficult to kind of lump in one experience in the terms of what educators are doing in New Jersey and throughout the country. And just to go back again to that added component of remote learning and recognizing that educators have an added challenge currently. They might not just be teaching to their student rosters, but they might be teaching to parents, family members, and guardians who are walking in and out of the classroom at different times. So how do we engage in conversations with the extended school community that we might not expect? And hopefully our resources and our core work at looking at an approach of that intellectual engagement, but also that emotional component and that ethical reflection helps educators start facilitating that dialogue with students.
That's awesome. Thank you. We're going to get back to you and talk a little bit more about the organization and the approach. I want to move on to these organizations themselves, but Rabbi Hirschfield, you said you might have a question before we learn a little bit more about Clal.
I do, because I'm very moved by what I'm learning from David and from Frank. And you guys should correct me if my recapitulating what I think I heard is wrong. You should jump in and say, I don't know what you're listening to, brother, but you're wrong. But I want to lift up Frank's premise, which I would summarize is you have to build ahead of the problem. If relationships and insight are not being cultivated ahead of the moment of crisis, it's very hard to step in. And in the spirit of trying to build ahead of these kinds of problems, David, you said something I really agree with, and I want to ask you both about it, which is we have to fight for norms and institutions. I could not agree more. Here's what I'm thinking about. That's exactly what the Capitol assailants thought they were doing. I'm not in any way saying, therefore, there's an equivalence between your sense of norms and institutions and theirs. I'm not. But given that they would say, if we put you behind a screen and they didn't hear your preamble, who's that man, David Simon? He says we have to fight for norms and institutions. We should have had him on stage with the president and Rudy Giuliani. He understands us. So in the short term, I'll go out on a limb. My response is pretty simple. When they do it, the fact that they think they're fighting for norms and institutions while they're, assaulting the Capitol, short-term response to me is simple. You put them in handcuffs and the criminal justice system should do its job. But what do we do long-term? Given that many of the same phrases and beliefs, they're not just phrases, that animate us and our work, if we said them absent them hearing them from us, they would go, that's exactly what we believe. And so how, to both of you, do you begin to address that without falling into some ridiculous moral equivalence? Because I'm not suggesting that, but they would assent. And the one thing I'll stop with is I once worked in Pakistan with Pervez Musharraf when he was the leader of the country. And he said something really interesting. He said, people confuse terrorists and terrorism. Okay, I was curious. He said, terrorists have to be killed. But that's no strategy for fighting terrorism. Now, we can agree or disagree. Did he mean it? Did he not mean it? Was it putting on a show? But that's irrelevant. The insight there. So I guess what I'm asking is, given that the terrorists often say they're fighting for the same things we're fighting for our sacred norms and institutions, what can we do to get ahead of the problem? Because we really disagree, and yet we say so many of the same things. What would you guys suggest?
David, I'm going to punt this back to you. The rabbi's asked a question, so you're going to have to answer it before I get back to him.
Okay, great. Thank you. That's an excellent question. And it does cut to the heart of the problem. But I think there's actually a fairly significant direct answer that sort of dodges the conundrum as you phrased it, and presents another one. It's one that I don't have an easy answer to either. But that's that there is a significant component of misinformation, disinformation, and sort of parallel news that's going on that informs, that makes people think we are all fighting for the same norms, except how can it be that we all, me on this side, them on that side, can say the same thing and make it sound like we're in the same struggle for the same thing, but we're fighting against one another. At some point, we're not fighting over, we're not trying to preserve the exact same thing. We have a different understanding of what that thing is. And it may not be, at the fundamental level, democracy. We're all fighting for democracy. We can agree upon that. But the reason why we're fighting on this, I don't want to say battlefield because I don't want to get too military about it, but why we're on this terrain is because one side sees in this particular instance, an election that was largely, free and fair. And, this is something, by the way, that I study African politics mostly. And, the phrase election is always paired with the word election is always paired with the phrase free and fair.
Free.
and with a question mark. Was that election free and fair? That's the thing that's always sort of up for judgment. I always took it for granted that it would be here. The other side is saying, that election happened, and there is, I'll apologies for the phone in the background, there is mountains of evidence that there was fraud. Now, and that's something I read in today, one of the New York Times articles today about the Proud Boy or one of the leaders of the movement, who was saying, you know, he was an Army veteran, and he cited the mountains of evidence. And then when someone said, well, what is the mountains of evidence? And he just insulted the inquisitor in response. He didn't actually have any specific evidence that there was that there's been fraud. So at some point it comes down to, in this case, it comes down to facts matter. But let me take a different case, the Rwanda, one that I'm very familiar with, that I study a lot. You know, how did Hutus and Tutsis come to get in this position where Hutus thought that, in Rwanda, thought that Tutsis were enemies of the state, every Tutsi individual in Rwanda was essentially a third column, was going to undermine the state, overthrow democracy. That was what Hutus were fighting for. Civilians, when they were committing genocide, they said they were doing it in the name of majoritarian democracy, and because they thought Tutsis were going to reinstall a monarchy. They thought they were the authoritarians. That led them to engage in a project of genocide. Now, they were wrong about that, but I'm not sure how they could have known, except for the fact that they were being told, they were being misinformed by their leaders, who knew better, who knew that the people that they were telling, that the Hutu leaders were telling the Hutu followers to kill, were not trying to reinstate a democracy, a monarchy, that they had been very explicit about having plans to work along the lines of a peace agreement, a multi-ethnic state that had been hammered out in a peace agreement. But they hid that fact. They lied to their followers. They presented a different set of facts. And that once you have a different set of facts, I think, you know, that's a key instrument. You've got, if you can sort of cloak your facts in common principles, that's the recipe for extremism, for fighting over the center. I don't think there's, I'm very conscious of the fact that I didn't point to the answer in there, but I won't pretend that I would be able to do that anyways. That's just my reflection, I suppose, on your very welcome provocation.
I think that was excellent. Frank, I mean, you're really in the business of getting ahead of the problem, we would hope, or you're educating students while they're hopefully still young enough to create their own moral compasses and understand some of these things. What happens? But then again, crises, I'm sure, pop up if you're dealing with young folks all the time. Do you feel like, as teachers in classrooms, that you're actually helping that you're preparing students to be able to get ahead of these kind of divisive problems? Or I don't know, it's very complicated, but tell us what your approach is to this particular question.
Sure, and I think it has to go back to the essential aspect of our work, and it might tie into the previous question as well, but the core of our work with educators in schools is that we intend our lesson to use the lessons of history to challenge teachers and their students to stand up to bigotry and hate. And how do you do that? That's not the easy question, that's not a quick answer, but all our case studies, all our lessons, we encourage educators to start off with the question of identity. Allow students to not only identify themselves, but to reflect on how do others in your community identify you. And it's an extremely powerful activity, and thinking about not only asking myself of how I self-identify, but how often are students asked to reflect on how others see them and what impact that have. And that's an extremely powerful initial activity when we start looking at the concept of we and they. What happens when identity or aspects of your identity are used to determine who belongs in a community, and equally, if not more importantly, who doesn't belong to a community. And the power of that for students to start with themselves, to have that reflection, to look at things that they think they've been asked all their lives of, who determines your identity? And the quick response is, oh, well, I do. And then, oh, so if you didn't want to go to school, would that be okay because you make the decision? Well, no, I can't make that decision for myself. I have to be here because my parents want me to. And then just provoking that conversation. And as a fair warning, we start most of our professional development off with, we realize that you may leave here with more questions than answers. And we encourage that. We encourage the follow-up of the conversation. And one of the quotes that really drew me to Facing History Resources when I was an educator was a student who went through a course, and to paraphrase, their experience was, they were talking about how they've had a variety of classes, but I've only had one class about being more human. And I think that's really at the core of our work, to focus on how can we introduce that human element to some of these historical events, these historical case studies. What common behaviors, beliefs, and attitudes can students readily observe in their own lives, but translate to these bigger historical events? Like I said, that concept of we and they. And from going there, how do you explore a historical case study like the Holocaust and analyze the patterns of human behavior and how they may be influenced by choices individuals and organizations have made? Looking at the past and looking at how individuals participated, stood by, or stood up in the face of injustice is a huge component of our core work. And looking at, like you said, how do we develop these skills, allow students to examine how the history continues to influence our world today. How would they consider to choose to participate in bringing about a more human, a more just, a more compassionate community that they belong to? And start thinking about, what communities do you actually belong to? Could be your classroom, it could be your school community, your local, or extended on a global front, but addressing stories that your communities are told. What is a single story? And going back to some of the other questions, it's so often that we're willing to write stories about other people and place our perception of identity onto others. But how do we step back and counter that single story? Thinking back to that well-known TED Talk, Dangers of a Single Story. And how do we provide students and educators the opportunity to counter that, to assess what is the story, what voices are included in your classroom, what voices do your students read and experience, but what voices don't your students hear? And how do we make it a more inclusive environment in terms of perspective and lenses? And again, not straying so far and ignoring the fact that if a norm is bigotry and hate, I don't think that's the same conversation as including all voices. That has to be recognized in terms of creating a contract and a classroom that, yes, we welcome dialogue, we welcome debate, but if it's purely about hate speech and hate language, then there is no place for that in a classroom community. And just to kind of wrap up another, I feel students' voices are much more impactful than one as an educator. And I just pulled this quote up. When I took the Facing History course back in 8th grade, it helped me understand that history was a part of me and that I was a part of history. If I understood why people made the choices they did, I could better understand how I make choices and hopefully make the right ones. And I think in terms of lessons, in terms of education, regardless of whether it's in a social studies class or a language arts class, a math class, a science class, a phys ed class, if we can equip students from making choices that recognize not only their humanity, but the humanity of others that they encompass a community with, I think that's a powerful goal and objective to have.
And I don't want to, before I move on, why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit more about Facing History first? What is the organization? Because maybe not a lot of folks on the call know what it is.
Sure, and Facing History and ourselves started in 1976 in Brookline, Massachusetts, with a primary focus of looking at Holocaust education. And from that time, it started in one classroom in one school and has continued to grow to have 7 offices across the United States and 2 internationally, with a network of over 100,000 educators who access our resources virtually, attend professional development with us, and go much more in depth through online seminars or summer seminars and partner schools that we have across the nation. With that, as we mentioned before, our primary goal is to provide lessons, strategies, and activities to combat bigotry and hatred using historical case studies. And going back to something I said before, our pedagogy just engages young people in challenging content and often difficult content through a process that builds on knowledge, skills, and dispositions that hopefully deepen civic engagement. Obviously, we're an educational institution, so intellectual rigor is a crucial part to what we do, but we also recognize that just academics alone isn't going to produce citizens that we necessarily want, that there has to be an emotional engagement, that resources have to emotionally connect with students. And we want informed, responsible, civically engaged students. So what tools and resources do we need to allow young people to learn how to advocate for themselves and others? Hopefully putting that three-piece part together to form an approach that translates into that.
Great, awesome. For people who are watching, we have links to all these organizations, and we'll send it out when we send out the recording if you want to learn more about these particular types of approaches and resources. Rabbi Hirschfield, I want to get back to you. You may have, I'm sure you've taken notes and have all sorts of other comments, but could you tell people a little bit, let's start about where you're coming from, let's put it that way. You're a rabbi, you're not a pulpit rabbi. You've had an interesting background. I know you in your own book, you were a fanatic yourself, you said, and now you're at Clal. What the heck is Clal? Tell the audience a little bit about what you do, how you got there, and what we should know about.
Okay, I'll try and do this without boring you all with too many details. Yes, I'm a rabbi. No, I'm not a pulpit rabbi. No, I never expected to be any kind of rabbi at all. In fact, I had a perfectly nice career emerging in the study of ancient Jewish history and early Christianity. And I liked life in the first century. It was interesting to me there. In fact, one of the reasons I liked being in the first century is it looked a lot like the 21st century or the 20th century when I started out. It was a time of great cultural, intellectual, and spiritual ferment. It was a time when the norms and institutions were being renegotiated, much as they were certainly in American life, both religious and secular, after the Holocaust. So there were a lot of things about it that made sense to, yes, I can spend my life there. And I didn't want to be a rabbi, with respect to rabbis, because there are plenty who don't do this. But by and large, rabbis end up, for combinations of reasons that are not important now, in sales. And the metric of success, by and large, whether it's Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, Reconstructionist, non-aligned, whatever it is how many people did I get to do Jewish the way I do Jewish? And I had no interest in that, because my own personal journey had done Jewish, where my reward for going to synagogue services on the second day of Rosh Hashanah was my parents took all the kids for quarter pounders with cheese at McDonald's. And we loved it. And we said a blessing before we ate it. And that was authentic and real and beautiful. And then by the time I was in high school, I had chosen to become Orthodox. And by the time I was 17, I was living in Israel, most of my time in Hebron, arguably the most disputed piece of property anywhere in the Holy Land. I was one of 60 Jews among 60,000 Palestinians. And I was there. Why? Because God said so. And from about 17 to 21, my inner and outer life was very much like a bumper sticker that you can see in the South, and actually probably on many of the cars of the people who assaulted the Capitol. Simple proposition. God said it. I believe it. That settles it. That was me. And for a variety of reasons, that came crashing down. But I remained religiously observant. And so I knew I didn't want to be in sales, because there were so many rich and interesting ways to Jew, as there are so many rich and interesting ways to Christian or Muslim or American or Rwandan or Indian. And so I didn't want to be in sales. I wanted to be in service. I still was in love with the tradition that I had spent my life being saturated in, even its many expressions, from quarter pounders with cheese to a Hebrew Bible in one hand and an automatic weapon in the other in Hebron. And I ended up meeting one of Clal's founders. Clal was founded about 45 years ago by two teachers of mine, Elie Wiesel and Rabbi Yitz Greenberg. And I became very close to Yitz. And what was amazing about Yitz was I met an Orthodox rabbi who actually wasn't in sales. he appreciated that there are a lot of ways to do Jewish. And I said, well, if I can be the kind of rabbi who's in service, not in sales, because actually what I'm in possession of is a remarkable 3,000-year-old toolkit. And the job is not to get people to paint my painting. The job is to give people the paints and the brushes and the canvases and encourage them to become artists. Now, it takes a lot of discipline and training, so this isn't simple. And I'm fully aware that I'm talking in the context of one of the great academic centers of the world for centuries. And that doesn't just happen. It takes a lot of discipline and a lot of hard work. So this is not, oh, do whatever you like, it's all okay. Very little good art comes from just playing around with the paint. You got to work at it. But it's also true that there are as many forms of great art as there are in the world, as there are people who want to paint great art. And so I ended up at Clal, and because Yitz, God, or the fates, or some combination have a sense of humor, I ended up being one of the two people running the organization. And the only thing that really has changed from that sense of a deep pluralism has been that it started out grounded in a deep pluralism after, since it is International Holocaust Remembrance Day, that both for Yitz and for Ellie, the deep sense that you couldn't do business as usual after the Shoah, after the Holocaust. And I don't mean that in a glib way. Ellie's world in Siget, along with most of his family, was burned to the ground. And Yitz, whose family was already in Brooklyn, though in an Orthodox community, his parents were Yiddish speakers. He came to realize somewhere between Brooklyn and a PhD in American Studies at Harvard, an ordination at an ultra-Orthodox seminary, can't do business as usual. And what was moving about them and remains moving to me about Clal is the dual commitment of you can't do business as usual when the world is changing, but you also don't need to abandon the business. And that somewhere in that creative tension between a deep rootedness in that 3,000-year-old toolkit and the appreciation that you can't just rely on doing business as usual, that's our work. What's changed over time is that it's not only inside of Jewish. It was, but to me, there is no question of pluralism or this kind of dual rootedness, both in a bold embrace of the future and a connection to the old business. That's a human question, it's not a Jewish question. And so the push for me has been to use Jewish tools on human questions, which is why, for example, today, my day included starting out in the morning, running a seminar for a bunch of American Jewish leaders on a book by Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who just passed away, a book called Morality. And then I went from there to a series of interviews for SiriusXM's Catholic channel, where I am a regular guest. And then I went from there to working with my editor-in-chief at Religion News Service, writing about the very issue we're talking about tonight. Don't worry, no one will be quoted. I respect that. To being here with all of you. Because there's two basic ideas shot through everything we do, whether it's the training of rabbis, the engaging of religious leaders from across the religious spectrum, Syria's project in Israel, in the Holy Land, in the Palestinian Authority, with Christian leaders, whether it's working with family foundations, whether it's creating entrepreneurial and intrapreneurial leadership for institutions, Jewish and other. Two premises. That when it comes to Jewish, there should be a place for anyone who wants one, regardless of dogma, doctrine, or belief. More radically, but the point of being Jewish or using Jewish isn't Judaism. Jewish is a way of being human. And my hope is to use the tools I know and love best, as I hope everyone does, to make some durable contributions to the communities beyond the place where we spend most of our time. So that's the work. And I could tell you endless ways in which it manifests itself, but I don't need any more than the fact that we're gathered here in the context of YANA with you, Rachel, leading the discussion, with the two brilliant co-panelists I'm privileged to be with all the people who are participating. That's Clal.
Excellent. Thank you. I'm sure you've always got great stories, but I think that really captures a lot of it. I'm gonna bump back to David, and as Rabbi Hirschfield said, there's lots of different ways of doing Jewish. There's lots of different ways of being an academic, and you probably have a lot of different things you were interested in. How did you come to do what you're doing, studying genocide, specifically the Rwanda and Holocaust, and at Yale? Tell us about that and what you do.
Sure, absolutely. You know, from a professional standpoint, I think it's sort of it's a little bit uninteresting, so I won't dwell on it. My own background was in what a colleague, when I was writing my dissertation, sort of derisively called straight up and down political science, which meant you've got your explanatory variable, your outcome, and I was like trying to figure out the number in between them. It was in Africa. It was a focus on political participation in Zambia. But when I started to teach classes, initially as a lecturer at, I think it was George Washington University, where I first sort of encountered the idea of, you know, they didn't want, oddly enough, they didn't want me to teach a class about political participation in Zambia. So I had to expand a little bit. I was teaching African politics, maybe it was African international relations. And I got to the week on the syllabus. This is 1999 or so. So the Rwandan genocide is fairly recent at that point. In some sense, it's still pretty recent. But I got to that point in the syllabus, and there was so much to talk about, so much to address, and 1 hour or 2 hours or whatever was allocated to it was so clearly not enough. And part of it was that, you know, there was so much really interesting works that was just starting to be published at that moment. Now it feels like there's almost too much being published on it. It's hard to wade through, but at the time, there's really a lot to choose from. But beyond that, I also found that looking at the Rwandan genocide was simultaneously a lens into all different elements of political science, whether it be international relations or the sort of comparative politics questions that we talked about earlier this evening, or political psychology, certainly. You know, how did some people get other people to kill yet other people? How did, you know, what was the psychology of mobilization? And I found all of those questions sort of intellectually fascinating, but also that there was, I felt that there was this you know, profoundly human level that it was almost disrespectful to teach this class and say, okay, for the next hour, we're going to talk and learn about the Rwandan genocide, and then on Thursday, it's going to be something else. And so it seemed disrespectful to the survivors, these voices that I had heard. I should say part of it, I guess this was slightly after the teaching, is I was lucky to be a postdoc at the Kennedy School at Harvard during a period in which Samantha Power was there for a year. She was writing at that point, A Problem from Hell, the story of American failures of genocide policy with respect to the Holocaust and genocide. Romeo Dallaire was there for a set of time. He was the officer in charge, the general in charge of the UN's military force in Rwanda as the genocide unfolded. Paul Kagame, the president of Rwanda, came through a couple times to give talks. So it felt like it just kept on hitting me in the side of the head that that this is something that, and again, all of these gave me opportunities to sort of see different human dimensions of that episode in our history. And at some point, there was no pulling away from it. It was a way to examine what seemed to be sort of pure evil, but evil that had names and identifiable people who at some point were not evil behind it. And so I wanted to understand the process by which that happened. And I came to recognize it both as a psychological process, but as a political scientist, also a political process. So from there, that drew me into the, understanding the genocide in Rwanda, sort of brought me into the fold of genocide studies, and I started taking a more comparative approach from there.
And just at the Yale, so how did you come to, or how did the center get started at Yale, and how do they decide what to cover? For example, like the Rohingya and the Uyghurs, or like there's a bunch of things going on that maybe haven't been specifically named as genocide within the sense of the UN word, but how do you guys get to do what you do?
That's a great question. The Genocide Studies program is not meant to be sort of an authoritative keeper of the canon of genocides. Rather, we look at cases when we can. We take up issues when they are sort of within our research interests. We're not a teaching body. We don't issue majors or certificates or anything, or even have classes that bear the Genocide Studies name and number. But I think in some sense, our story is that we began as under the guidance of Ben Kiernan, who is a historian who had been in Cambodia right after the fall of the Khmer Rouge, and he spent the decade of the 80s. He's Australian. He spent the decade of the 80s in Cambodia, doing research on Cambodia, studying the what we now know as the Cambodian genocide, but gathering documents as well. And part of his reason for doing this was that he wanted to see the people who were responsible for mass violence, mass atrocities, and genocide in Cambodia. He wanted to see them held accountable for it. But during the 80s, there was really no political prospect of that happening, in part because the United States policy was to recognize the successor regime, or the Khmer Rouge in exile, shorn of Pol Pot, as the rightful rulers, because the regime that chased the Khmer Rouge from power was a Vietnamese puppet and a Soviet puppet by extension in the sort of Cold War, Southeast Asian Cold War lens of the day. So that put off there's going to be no reckoning of the Khmer Rouge as long as they were ostensibly in official circles our ally. There's a big State Department, especially a Reagan State Department and Tip O'Neill Congress split there. But by the 90s, there came to be this sort of recognition that yes, the Khmer Rouge were the responsible ones, and that there should be a process. The problem was that an accountability process. The problem was that accountability process needed to be created, and it was going to take either an action by the government of Cambodia and ultimately by the United Nations to put that process in place. It finally started around 2007 or so. In the interim, there was this question Ben Kiernan had. I have all this. He said, I have all this documentation of what happened, and his great hope was that it would be used at some point. It would be applied towards a mechanism of accountability, towards trials. But those trials didn't exist. So to preserve them and sort them and organize them and sort of keep them as a recognized body, he was actually awarded, or Yale was awarded, a grant from the State Department. This is now the Clinton era State Department, aligned with the with Congress, that to create what was called then the Cambodian Documentation Project, Cambodian Genocide Documentation Project. From that, it evolved into a program that brought in or tried to bring together people from around campus who were interested in other regions in which genocides or mass violence against civilians had taken place. Just as a sort of coda to that, in some ways we're returning to those roots now, in that with respect to Myanmar, for example, we are and with respect to the sources of information and misinformation that lay at the root of violence in Myanmar, we're now trying to do something very similar, which is collect and figure out ways to help the storage of data that points to the accountability of those responsible for violence, and I actually do think genocide is the appropriate word, against the Rohingya in Myanmar. A lot of that data is now on social media, it's digital data. We've got no interest in keeping it on our servers. It's not our data to collect and to hoard, but we don't want that data to be destroyed. So one of the big projects that we're engaged with we call it Mass Atrocities in the Digital Era, or MADE, involves things like figuring out what mechanisms can be used or created, if they have to be created, to preserve the documentation that might point to the culpability of those responsible for fomenting violence in a place like Myanmar.
Excellent, thank you. Yes, we are recording this, so if people have to leave early, we'll have time. And I want to sort of wrap up with a question for everybody, and then we'll take some Q&A from the audience. But since this is Holocaust Remembrance Day, and one of the things we wanted to focus on, we've certainly heard a lot of different perspectives on how one teaches or studies, the differences, and how these things came to be. And Franklin, we'll start with you. How was it the Holocaust taught in a way that is relevant to young folks, in a way that maybe you're hopeful, or the way that it's taught through Facing History, that hopefully will engage a new generation of people that these things won't happen, because they clearly keep happening around the world. And we in America have a lot of stuff to work with too, but at least from your perspective and dealing with the kids you deal with.
And I had a lot of notes on this question, and then just as you're asking it, it caused me to reflect on my last year in the classroom. And I had the honor of teaching a full year Holocaust and genocide awareness course to high school juniors and seniors. And I remember using this resource out of Facing History's Holocaust and Human Behavior guide, and it was titled Voices in the Dark. And it's a primary source document about a World War I German Jewish veteran who was riding this dark railroad car in Germany in the 1920s. And on that car, in that darkness, he heard people doing hate speech on aspects of his identity, and just really having conversations out loud about marginalizing members of the German society and what should be done to different identities within Germany. And as the car stopped and as they exited the car, the people who were fostering this hate speech came under a lamppost. And he recognized that the person who was talking the most was somebody who played on the same soccer club as him, and someone who he shared the same jersey with. And one aspect was this shared community on the soccer field, but in the darkness of this railroad car had an entirely different identity. And when I was doing this reading with students, one student raised his hand and he asked, "We've been reading about stuff like this all year. When are we going to talk about something current?" And the student in front of him, she quickly turned her head around and she goes, and I'll never remember this because she had her finger out, and she's like, "If you've been paying attention, everything we've been reading is current." And she said, "Think about what we just read and think about how we act on social media." And in that moment, the thing that, number one, as a teacher, I was proud that she was making some of these historical connections to the current moment. But I noticed, and it always stuck out to me, that the pronoun she chose to use was we. Not other people, not you, but it was we. And after that class, I went up to her and I was like, "I really enjoyed your reflection on the article, but I noticed that you said we when you were talking about participation on social media." And she's like, "I have to be honest, I know how I act on social media, and the things I say on there aren't always right, but this course is making me think about how I want to be seen on there." And while that's kind of an extended answer about why the Holocaust should be taught, that moment for me as an educator always stuck with me, because it was connecting that historical primary source to her life and seeing that the choices that she makes do have the potential to impact others, and not in a positive way. In New Jersey, where the educators that I work with and where I taught, there is a Holocaust mandate that does say that the Holocaust is mandated to be taught in New Jersey school classrooms, but that means a variety of things. And from classroom to classroom, the lessons that are used are very different, and the messages that are approached are very different. And from our standpoint, and I think, David, you said it wonderfully as well, in the title of our resource, Holocaust and Human Behavior. Yes, our goal is to teach the history, to look at the particular historical context of Germany at the time, the events that led from a democracy to the dictatorship, that went from the marginalization of citizens and members of societies, and then expanded to genocide under the cover of war. And we want students to wrestle with the concepts of choices people made as individuals, groups, and nations, and what the responses were and why were those responses. And again, coming back, as I said many times, just choices. And to make connection to themes that transcend beyond that, the theme of democracy, the theme of citizenship, but also themes of racism, anti-Semitism, that this history raises, but the world we live in today also raises. To understand what responsibilities that they do have as citizens in their world, in their communities, to bring back that human element, to bring back that goal of humanity. And it's difficult recognizing that so much has to be taught in a short period of time, but I had a full year course to it and I still barely touched on the surface of material that I wanted to, but it's not something that could be done in one afternoon and then say, the bell's ringing, have a good lunch, we'll see you next week or in the next class, and have an entirely different topic. It goes back to what we said at the beginning, that relationship building, that looking at the concepts of identity, the human behavior that leads to the concept of we and they, and marginalization and isolation and decision making as a community and a society, and the impact that has. And again, just concluding with connecting it to students' lives today, that emotional connection, that questioning of how do the choices I make not only impact me, but impact the people that I want to surround myself with, and I am surrounding myself with, and where do I go from there? And I think, just briefly stated and kind of talking on a bigger level from that story, that is one I think of. I went home that day and really had some reflective moments about what I wanted to do in the classroom and go from there, and definitely looked at the resources I was bringing in to hopefully continue that conversation. But I think from an organizational standpoint, we also stand by that, and just those connections, that sense of emotional engagement. But the challenging material that we look at is not easy, and it does involve building those communities that we can engage in difficult conversations as educators, but also said at the beginning as also students who are learning from our classes as well.
Beautiful. Well, I think there obviously is so much more we could talk about, but I appreciate, I'm sure a lot of you in the audience, that you doing what you're doing, that you're making a difference, that hopefully you're catching students to reflect and think about, and that ties in beautifully to Rabbi Hirschfield's, one of those opened with was, you're teaching them how do they think about who do they want to be, who do we want to be. So that's a beautiful way to see that. Rabbi Hirschfield, we're at the end of our hour and I want to give time for Q&A. So you can close out with whatever it is you want, a story you haven't told, some things you'd like us to think about before we go. I'll give you that before I return it back to David.
So let me try and tie it to the fact that it is International Holocaust Remembrance Day, and the way both David and Frank spoke about their work, which I find remarkably moving and actually quite hopeful. And it's not simple to say that, because of course, the fact that there is an International Holocaust Remembrance Day is itself, hard to believe probably for many of you, very upsetting to many people who say, what are you talking about? We observe Yom Hashoah. It's a Hebrew word, and that's because it's Jewish, and it's all about Jewish suffering. And I don't mean that glib, because that's real to me, both because that's my extended family and because that's a real part of the story of the Holocaust. But here's the thing. The fact that there is an International Holocaust Remembrance Day, which does not focus uniquely and expressly on the suffering of Jews, of the mass murder of Jews, is remarkably hopeful to me. Because I don't care how many museums get built and how many classes get given. If any story belongs to only one people, then that's where the story ends. I don't believe that pain and suffering are commodities, that the more people identify with them, they become less valuable. I think it's just the opposite. The more people who can identify with it. And by the way, the Holocaust Museum in Rwanda is a beautiful and powerful example of that. However you feel about Paul Kagame, they got that museum really right. There's no sense that identifying with the horrors that happened to someone else make your horrors less important. It's just the opposite. Human sensitivity is like light. The more you have of it, the more you have of it. It doesn't become dim somewhere else. The challenge, it seems to me, is not simply how to remember the past, because the brutal truth is we're going to forget the past. Believe me, 100 years after the Crusades, no Muslim or Jew thought they'd ever forget the Crusades. They've been slaughtered in unprecedented numbers from France to the Holy Land. But you know what? Happily, we human beings, we recover. That's actually a good thing. So it's not only about remembering the past, it's to do what I call learning how to remember forward. And remembering forward means, how do you hold the past in a way that honors the authentic and unique suffering that is part of every past story, but does so in a way that makes us more aware, more committed, and more able to make sure that it doesn't happen again. So the one quick story I would share, since you asked for a story, is not a story of me, it's a story of a man named Otto Olendorf. Otto Olendorf was a commander of one of the Einsatzgruppen, the shooting squads that did their most significant work across the Ukraine before Nazis figured out, there are more efficient ways to murder Jews. You could actually save, they did the calculations, we have the records, about 2 cents relative to the price of a Mauser bullet if you would build death camps. So you want to know exactly what a human being, a Jew, a gypsy, a gay person was worth? About 2 cents. Because that was the savings that accrued to the Reich by building death camps as opposed to shooting squads. So the war ends and the trials begin. And it was amazing how every commander of every unit that was tasked with mass murder was never around on the days they were murdering people. They were home with their wife. They were getting drunk with their friends. They were sleeping with their mistress. They were never around when the shooting was done, when the gassing was done, when the burning was done. Never around. Olendorf walks in and tells the Nuremberg judges, I'm going to do something unprecedented today. I'm going to tell you the truth. I was around. And it wasn't easy. It wasn't easy to shoot babies in their mother's arms. I had to steel myself to be able to do this. In fact, before the war, I had thought about careers in the ministry and in medicine. And here I was, an SS officer, leading a shooting squad. And it was hard. But I did it because I had become convinced that if we could get through this one horrible task, we would actually bring on a glorious world. So for me, a big piece of the work is not just to deal with the ugly motivations that we identify in others, because the truth is, those are relatively easy to fight against. It's the seductions of the redemptive ideologies that promise us, if we just get rid of those people, of that problem, everything will be perfect. So for me, the task of remembering forward, I want us not just to talk about sensitivity and compassion and inclusion, all of which I deem to be sacred. But I would invite us, especially on this day, to ask one question. Whatever system we're a part of, since nothing includes everybody, how do we treat those who aren't in? And I'm pretty sure that if we're willing to live with that awareness, regardless of how narrowly constructed or widely constructed our communities and institutions are, because even at the most widely constructed, they're excluding people, and the work of Priya Parker and others demonstrates how sometimes even when they're narrowly constructed, they can be quite inclusive in orientation. The real question seems to me, if we want to remember forward well, is how do we remain cognizant of those who aren't inside with us? How do we teach about them, talk about them, and treat them? I'm pretty sure if we can get better at that, we can make sure that that phrase, never again, which is somewhere between profoundly true and already a truism, actually, we could live. We could make sure it actually works out that way. That's for me the task at hand. That's remembering forward.
That's a beautiful way of leaving us. I don't know, David, if you wanted to have a final comment, or we could go to questions. I mean, we could sit here and reflect on Rabbi Hirschfield's comments forever. David, did you want to add something? Otherwise, I'm starting to see some questions in the audience.
Let's go to questions. I'm happy to let Rabbi Hirschfield have not quite the last word, but the last word of this component, because I agree with you. That was beautiful.
Okay. Well, it's now time. We've certainly been here for a while. I want to thank everyone. If anybody wants to ask a few questions of the panelists, our chat will be saved. So if it doesn't get, the panelists don't see these and get back to you, I'll be sure to forward it. If there's some specific ones, Frank, I think there were a couple of folks who were talking about curriculum and things like that, might be to you. David, there's a question that I think you might be able to answer, had to do with the study of neuroscience, and your major they keep talking about the beauties of being at a place like Yale with the interdisciplinary stuff. Does that kind of, you've talked about human behavior, but getting into work, you're a Sapolsky follower, which I love his work, human biological, components of behavior. Is that stuff coming into understanding how these things happen, or how we can prevent these things happening on international levels?
But I don't know about international levels, but it is part of this question of how are people mobilized to kill their neighbors if that's what is asked of them. And the truth of the matter is, I don't know, not with respect to answering that question, but to the previous question, to a sort of earlier question, which is, well, who does the killing in these episodes? It's not everybody. There are really two tasks that the organizers have to mobilize, have to put into action. The first one is to engage people to do their killing, to do their dirty work. And there may be some room for neuroscience. I have to admit that's not my field, and I wish I could say, rattle off the three scholars who have done the most important work there, but I don't know it. But I do know that that's one of the sort of considerations that looking for, is there some way that the sort of the more the most active killers, do they share some psychological, defect is probably the wrong word, but is there some profile, some pathology that can be identified? I'm actually, the first person though I think of in terms of answering that question is not the neuroscience experts who have found that, but a social psychologist named James Waller, who runs the Auschwitz Center for Peace and Reconciliation, although they've changed their name recently. But he says that it's typically the studies that he looks at least from a social dimension, not a medical side, have failed to find a solid connection there. That rather, there may be some what people in the 60s used to talk about as an authoritarian personality, or some more greater proclivity to sort of follow orders, and maybe believe in something that's consistent with the worldview. But it's really, as Jim Waller says, that it's kind of the monster inside all of us that is what makes it so important to recognize and to study. Just to follow up, because I said that there were two tasks. The second task, that's the task for the 2% or 5% or 10% who's going to do the dirty work. The other task is to figure out how to get the other 90 to 98% to not get in the way. And that's actually the part that stuns me, that they're able to accomplish that. And yet sort of seeing our society work as it does, it's people do let things happen. There is this inclination to believe the worst of what they're being told, to believe a story, to respond to very subtle but persistent intimidation, sort of structural intimidation, and to prevent people from standing up and doing something. And so this is why I'll conclude with a sort of shout out to what Frank's doing and the great work of Facing History and ourselves. Every society needs an inoculation from that effort to keep the 90% from getting in the way. And that has to happen in our schools, in our other places of communities of faith, communities of civil society. That's where it has to be, to bring it into the COVID era. One of the things that frightens me, that scares me about this era, we were talking before about the mental health challenges before we opened up the room, about mental health challenges of COVID, is that the isolation, the civil society, the fact that we have to have this meeting on this computer screen and not in a room in New York. It's so isolating. We're much more. It's much harder to form bonds of sort of common civil belonging, and probably much easier to start believing things that others are going to tell us. And I worry, not so much here. I think I really do think our institutions are strong, and in some sense, the lesson of the past month has been that they hold when pressed. But every country in the world is going through something like this, and many of them do not have the same institutions, and many of them, whatever bond, whatever inoculation is found in civil society to against the extremist projects, that inoculation is weakening. It's losing its resistance and its resilience, and that's what scares me about the world today.
Well, I hate to end on sort of that cautionary note, but you guys have all given us some incredible backgrounds into where you come from and the work that you do in many different ways. And I thank you all for joining us in a kind of a unique Holocaust Remembrance Day. And I hope everyone in our audience enjoyed this conversation. Unless any of you had one last thing you wanted to say before we sign off, I'm cognizant of the time, and I appreciate those who've hung in with us. We could go on forever and ever and ever, but thank you to Professor David Simon, to Rabbi Brett Hirschfield, and to Franklin for doing the work that you do. I hope we can continue some of these conversations and hear more about how things are going in your work in the future. So thank you to everyone. Have a wonderful evening, and we'll definitely be in touch. And,
thank you, Rachel. Thank you, YANA. And thank you to all the people who participated with us, because without all of you, like, what are we doing here? So, although I have to say, learning from Frank and David was pretty cool for me selfishly. So I really appreciate that. But thank you, Rachel, for bringing us together. Really.
Thank you. And Frank, keep it up with those students. You're doing an amazing job. You're probably the toughest job out of all of us. So glad to hear you're having a good impact there.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It was an honor to be here today and to learn from my wonderful co-panelists. I have more notes, I think, written down after this meeting than I had going into this. So thank you for that.
We did our job. Okay, good. All right. Have a great, safe evening, everyone. Take care, and we'll see you in the next program.
Thanks very much, everybody. And thank you, Rachel, Frank, and Brad.